All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. We are going to be recording this session today, so there will be a copy of this available after the fact. Same for any of you that weren't able to join us live. I'll also be including a copy of the PowerPoint deck itself, as there are going to be some links in here to helpful resources, particularly around tokens as we start to dive into that. Getting started for today, this is MCE Prep Part 2 on targeting and personalization. But a little bit about the exam itself. It is a total of 75 questions. You have a 90-minute time frame in which to do so, and a 70% score or higher is required to pass. The exam itself is a proctored exam. This is regardless of whether you take it at Summit or choose to do it from your home or office. It can be done remotely on your computer or at a local testing site. If you do it remotely, though, because it is proctored, you do need to have a webcam and microphone available. So just a couple of things to have in mind as you're working toward that. The exam itself is broken into 5 parts. These are the different pieces that we have our weekly webinars around as we work toward preparing for this over the course of the next month or so. Last week, we had our program fundamentals section, which covers about 30% of the exam. This week's targeting and personalization, it's about 16% of the exam. And you can see the rest here for analytics and reporting, lead management, and implementation and operations. This can be helpful as you start to work through studying and where you really want to make sure you're focusing on, identifying your areas of weakness, and then knowing how much of the exam that takes up so that you can make sure to dedicate your time appropriately. Speaking of Summit, the Summit scheduler is now open. If you're registered, I do strongly recommend getting in there and selecting the sessions that you wish to identify and attend. If you're not registered for a session, you can be waitlisted. Priority is given to pre-registered attendees. So if there is a session you really want to attend, if you're not registered, there's a possibility that you may not be admitted to that session at Summit. So definitely recommend jumping on there as they will fill up very quickly. This year's Summit sessions for Marketo are spread throughout the week, starting Monday afternoon through Thursday midday. So there is a wide variety of opportunities to attend a Marketo session. And if there are ones that you're not able to attend, Marketo does typically record these sessions, or the speakers also are often recording on their own as well. So don't worry too much if you don't get access to one that you're looking for. But as I mentioned, do try to get in there and get signed up as quickly as you can. So for today's agenda, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about targeting and personalization. Some of the big areas of focus for this portion of the exam are tokens and segmentations. So today we're going to cover what are some of the different token types and how to use them, as well as things like inherited and overridden tokens. Then we're going to dive into segmentations. During this section, we're actually going to jump over to my Sandbox instance, and we're actually going to build a segmentation together and show the difference between segmentations and smart lists and how to use the two, how they function differently, as well as some of the similarities or where they cross over, and how to bring that into things like dynamic content and snippets. Also going to cover a couple of sample exam questions so that you can get a feel for the types of questions that are asked on these two different sections, and leave some room for questions at the end. So getting started with tokens. What are tokens? When you're talking about Marketo, tokens are essentially a variable that can be used throughout the system, whether that's smart campaigns, your flow steps there, emails, landing pages, snippets, web campaigns. But it gives you the ability to bring data from one place in the system into another. It can be used to make things feel more personalized, like a first name, for example, Dear John in an email. Or it can be used to copy information about activities that have occurred into an interesting moment, what link someone clicked or what form they filled out, what asset they downloaded. It can also be used for recording information like the date and time in which an activity occurred. Think of your GDPR and compliance requirements, making sure things are date stamped. So there's a lot of different ways that tokens can be used. There's actually quite a variety. Person tokens, company tokens, campaign, system, trigger, program, my tokens, and member tokens. essentially a variable for all of the different areas or topics that you might need in Marketo to make sure that you can get the information from one place to another very easily and have that information potentially differ from person to person. So when it comes to person tokens specifically, this is one of the most common ones. This is usually where people start out, maybe the first tokens that you've ever used. When you're building these tokens and putting them into things like emails and landing pages, these are the ones that start with lead. These are unique to an individual person. So something like email address, first name, job title, company name, any custom fields that you might have in Marketo or Salesforce that are associated with an individual person. These are your person tokens. And so you'll see here in the picture on the right-hand side, it's your greetings, lead.first name. You'll also see after that in the image, default equals earthling. Default is something that Marketo lets you identify what value you would want there if your variable that you're looking for has an empty or blank value. So for example, if you don't have a first name for a person, that value is empty. Instead of greetings and then a blank space with an exclamation mark, what we see here is default earthling. So instead that email would read, greetings, earthling. Otherwise, you end up with that awkward space in there that looks like something was supposed to be there and didn't work properly. So this can still give you that ability to make that feel very personal for the people whose information you have, and then not make it feel awkward for people whose information you don't. Company tokens are the types of information that would come over from the account level. So if you're referencing the parent company, country, city, notes about the company, their website, the account owner's email address, as well as, again, any custom fields that exist on the accounts. The same rules apply that we saw with the lead token there. They can be used for things like emails and landing pages to create that personalization, or default values could be put in place as well. Maybe, for example, you might not have the company name for someone. You've got first name, last name, email address, that sort of thing. But you do want to reference company name for most of your audience. Maybe you could put something like your company or industry name on your landing page when you say, hey, here's a white paper for your company. Here's a white paper for healthcare companies. Here's a white paper for individual's person, company name. So it gives you that flexibility too to bring in that personalization. This can also be things that could be used for alerts for sales team members. If you want to identify a person who filled out a form from a specific company, you could include some of the information that we know about their company here, annual revenue, employee size, headquarters, that sort of thing. A note of warning, though, about tokens. When you are using tokens in an email, in the email editor, oftentimes you might go up to the option to create a custom pre-header. Tokens do not work in a pre-header. If you use something like the first name token, it's going to fail. The chances are more likely that it's actually going to draw in the incorrect information. So where you might be sending an email to John, the pre-header text might say, Dear Sarah. But then when they open the email itself, it's still going to say Dear John. So it can cause some confusion and be a little bit complicated in that area. If you do want that information to pull into the pre-header, you're going to actually want to take out the custom pre-header and revert back to a default. This is going to draw information from your HTML or the text-only version of your email. And if you have a token in place there, your text only starts with Dear John, then that's what's going to pull into the pre-header. So it's a little bit of a workaround there. But definitely something to keep in mind if you are going to be using person or company tokens in an email. Now, some of the other tokens that exist in the system are campaign tokens. This gives you the ability to draw some of this information in, particularly for things like interesting moments or email alerts to sales team. Information about the campaign name, the ID, or campaign description. System tokens is the one that I had mentioned before as a particularly like a GDPR compliance type piece. This top ones here, system date, system time, and system date time, are used for timestamping when an activity occurred. So in the image on the right here, this is something where double opt-in We are recording what the date and time is that that action occurred. There are also these three bottom ones here, the system.forward to a friend link, the unsubscribe link, and the view as a web page link. These are actually URLs essentially that Marketo will generate when it recognizes that token. I highlighted the system.unsubscribe link here in red as a very important call out. If this token is present in your email as a link to your unsubscribe page or subscription management page, Marketo recognizes this and it'll put in the URL of that page. But if on that unsubscribe button, you have the actual URL of the page, Marketo does not recognize that as a, in a way, valid URL for an unsubscribe link. And so that's when you see situations where Marketo will auto append information at the very, very bottom under the HTML of your email that says, this email has been sent to email address. If you wish to unsubscribe, click here. That's because your email doesn't have the system.unsubscribe token as your unsubscribe link. And so that's a default behavior for Marketo. If that's something that you're seeing in your emails, check out the HTML. See if you've got the URL there or if you've got the system.unsubscribe token. That's going to make the difference there. And the forward to a friend link and view as web page links. This is something that you see a lot in HTML emails that go out. You might see these links at the top of the page. Forward to a friend allows someone to send a copy of this email without sending over their unique Marketo Munchkin information. So you're able to then get a new person's information without appending opens and clicks to the person that email was forwarded from. So hopefully people use that and not just forward directly, but that can sometimes be a little bit complex. And then the view as a web page link, of course, takes it out of the email platform that they're in and into a web page. I have included here a link to the systems token glossary. These are just a couple of the system tokens that are available through Marketo. There's a huge list as well as their definitions. So that's what this link heads out to. It's a very valuable resource to have. And in fact, something that I keep bookmarked on my browser because it is something that I tend to reference very often. Likewise, trigger tokens. These are also system-generated information that can pull activity or action information and use it for interesting moments or email alerts. You can take information like, what was the trigger name? What was the trigger, the name of the action that set off this trigger, the second one there. That could be the form that they filled out. That could be the asset they downloaded, the web page they visited, links that they clicked. All of this is information that you can use to pull into your interesting moments, for example, as a way to say, hey, this person, we had this triggered smart campaign of if a person fills out a form, we want to create an interesting moment. Well, then this right here on the right-hand side would pull the information of what the form name was and the page that it was filled out on. So for example, if you wanted your sales team to know what content someone had downloaded, this could be put in this way. So this is a really great way to do that. And at the bottom here, again, a link to how to use some of these different tokens for interesting moments. I'm actually going to bounce over to that page for a second to show you a little bit about how that's structured. That link goes to this page here, which will tell you the different trigger tokens that are available and what they apply to in Marketo. If you see a green check mark, that means that there's data available for that specific activity. If you see something where there's a blank, that means there would return no value there. So for example, this is a trigger.link. For email bounces hard, well, if an email hard bounces, there wasn't an action of someone clicking on a link, so there wouldn't be a link to pull. So that's why you don't see anything there. But this is an entire chart that covers all of the different trigger tokens that are available. So this is also very, very helpful if you're sitting there and putting that together and you're thinking to yourself, do I need trigger.trigger name or do I need trigger.name? What am I looking for? Pop over here and reference this. It's a great resource to have. Now, after our trigger tokens, we also have program tokens. We can pull information about what the Marketo programs are that people are interacting with, drop those into similar interesting moments or email alerts. And then we can also start to create custom tokens. These can be created on the folder level. They can be created on the program level. And then they can also be carried from a top level or higher level program or folder down to programs and folders that are underneath of it. One of the custom tokens that you can find or create in Marketo is the member.webinar URL. This would be used if you have an integration with a webinar program that generates unique URLs for registrants. This can be done on an event program level. The event has to be integrated with your webinar provider, but it can be used then to send out things like registration emails and send someone a unique URL. I will mention this is also one of the very few tokens that can be used inside of another token. What do I mean by that? When you're building a program and you're starting to structure out your program, the main page at the top level of your program has a tab on the third one over that says My Tokens. This is where you can create custom tokens that apply specifically to that program. But you cannot nest one token inside of another. So for example, if you were to have, like what we have here, an event name or a webinar date, you might have that as a text-only token because it's just a short piece of information, but you won't be able to nest that somewhere else. It won't work. That webinar member URL is the only one, and that works very well to be nested inside of a calendar file. So if you do send out that registration email and you want to say, hey, add to calendar, click here, you can include those member URLs right into that calendar file so that it would add right to their system. But otherwise, creating tokens like this gives you the ability to customize information around a program that might be something that could be used repeatedly throughout the program. The examples that I have here, as you can see, venue, city, event name, webinar date. If you think of the types of programs that you'd build here, webinars, events, something like that, the information in these example tokens are things that are going to be exactly the same throughout your entire event program, whether that's registration emails, reminders, confirmation emails, follow-ups, that sort of thing. This information will never change. And so tokens actually allow you to enter information in one place and have it cascade down from there to everything that's underneath of it that uses that token value. This is also something that I tend to use a lot in building my scoring programs, so that way I know if I'm making an update to a value, that it's automatically going to update everywhere that score token is used. I don't have to spend time hunting through smart campaigns to find it or different alerts. It's always going to be there. And so this is actually what it looks like when you start to build that information out. This is a webinar program that I built, and you can see here that it's got information about the webinar title, date, time, speakers, links, subject lines. In fact, I have an entire program here that's controlled by just 12 tokens. This controls 4 emails, a landing page, a registration landing page, a thank you page, and a follow-up email. So this actually lets me turn out programs very, very quickly. Clone it, update your information, get it out the door. If you've got things that change along the way, you can update your tokens, and it's going to update all of that information. But as you can see here, this lists at the top that this is local. Local tokens are ones that are just specific to the program in which you're in. At the bottom of what this page has, there's also inherited and overridden tokens. So this is, as I mentioned, where you can create tokens at the folder level above a series of programs. Or if you do a lot with nested programs within things like nurtures or nesting email programs inside of default programs, you can carry this information down to everything that's underneath of this. The biggest example I see would be on your marketing activities folder, having a token for copyright year, and then using that in the footer of your emails and in your landing pages. That way, when the calendar turns from, say, 2020 to 2021, for example, instead of having to go in and edit and reapprove every single one of your assets, all you have to do is make a quick change to that token and it's going to cascade down to everything. If, for example, though, you have a program where maybe you need to change that information only for that program, you can actually double click on that variable, that 2020 there, make an update to 2021, and it's going to say that this is now an overridden token. It was information that was inherited, but we didn't want the inherited information, so we changed it just for this program. So that is an option as well. But this is something too that can be a big time saver. As I mentioned, especially copyright year as an example. If you've got information used in a lot of different places that you want to be able to update very quickly without having to hunt through and do, one at a time. So it's a big time saver from that perspective. Now, as I mentioned with default values, it's important to have something there so that you're not displaying an empty value. But one important item to note here, how are your systems structured? For example, if you're using Salesforce, maybe you have first name and company name as required fields for a person to be created. If there's no value, Salesforce by default might write unknown into that field. So then when you go to send out an email, for example, that is dear lead.firstname, and you want that to populate as, dear John, dear Sarah, dear Michael, whatever, you have a default of dear friend. If the field itself isn't actually empty, Marketo is going to look at that and look at unknown as an actual valid first name. And it's not going to populate that with the friend default. You're instead going to send out emails that say dear unknown. I've also seen this happen on landing pages that are around company name. The setting in Salesforce was if company name is blank, set to unknown. Default healthcare. So when someone first came to the landing page to download a white paper, it was, hey, here's information for the healthcare industry, as opposed to here's information for your company. And so a person visiting for the first time would see healthcare, they'd fill out the form, but then when they would come back, they would see their information populated in the form, but now the top of the page says, here's some information for unknown. So it was an undesired behavior. It meant that using personalization in that landing page was something that they weren't able to do because of their Salesforce rules. Instead, it would be a Salesforce process change to allow company name to be blank in order for that to be that field to be emptied out and then be able to be used in that way. So if you are going to use personalization on emails and landing pages, I strongly recommend taking a look first at the smart list and seeing what values exist for the people who qualify for that, or what the potential values are in your system for those fields when it comes to things like company name. That way you can avoid some gotchas there. Now, segmentations. Segmentations are a huge part of Marketo's ability to use things like dynamic content and function in similar ways to smart lists in some capacities. Segmentations allow you to group people into distinct profiles for reporting and dynamic content. So basically what this means is you might take your database and classify it into segmentations based on things like job title or job function, industry, product of interest, geography, language, things that you might use repeatedly throughout Marketo's system, maybe to display certain content based around that segmentation or for reporting purposes. But the important thing to note is that these are going to be the types of things that you're going to want to use over and over again when you're thinking of what types of segmentations you might build. The reason I mention that is Marketo allows you to create 20 segmentations, whereas things like smart lists are unlimited. And if it's something that's a one-off, you don't necessarily need the level of depth that goes to building a segmentation. Order matters. So when you are building a segmentation, you actually set the order for your segments, and a person is only going to get the content for the first segment that they qualify for in that segmentation. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you're doing a segmentation that is around job function as well as industry, maybe you're looking at things like technology, and you want to have a segment that focuses on C-suite, your CTO, your CIO, that level. Then you want to focus on your director of technology. Then maybe you want to have something in there around manager and senior manager, and then a general catch-all bucket of anybody who's got technology in their title. When you're ordering your segments, if you start with your C-suite at the top, anybody that qualifies for that, they're going to hit that first bucket, and they're going to be able to get your targeted information that's specific to the C-suite. And then on down from there, director, manager, and then anybody that doesn't hit those other criteria would fall in your default bucket. But if you were to have that order in reverse, and you were to start with anyone whose job title contains technology, and then move into something like your C-suite director and manager below that, the chances are that you're going to have a really, really small number of people in those lower segmentations, because people are going to get caught by that upper bucket. So whereas you might have wanted to send very specific information to the C-suite, they're now going to get that generic and general messaging that's going to everybody with technology in their title, because the order of the segmentations. There's a worksheet linked out here that's a good way to start thinking about this process when you're starting to consider how you're going to build your segmentations, or especially building out ones for the first time. But let's actually go over to the sandbox and we'll build one of these together. So the segmentations live within the database section of your instance. There's a default folder there that exists already called segmentations. And so when you right click on that, you have the choice to build a new segmentation. Now for this one, we're going to create an example based on that job function technology. Our first section, we might do technology, job title, C-suite, director, manager. Now, as I mentioned, our segments here are going to go in the order that they're listed. So you can actually create these and type them in any order you want, and then go back and reorder them afterward if you decide, hey, that's not the order of priority that I want. I'm going to shift this around a little bit. There's always going to be a default bucket. This is for anybody that doesn't qualify for these segments that you've created. It's not something that you can delete. It's there by default. But with the ones that you do create, you can delete them if needed, as well as reorder. So once we've got in here the different segments that we need for this, and you can have up to 100 segments in each of your segmentations, we're going to go ahead and hit create. So right now this tells us this segmentation doesn't have any members yet, because we need to define who qualifies for each of these sections. And we would start that by clicking on the segment that we want to identify and building out the smart list that defines who those people are. For this one, since we're focusing on information around job title, so this could be job title contains chief, for example, or job title contains CIO, CTO, that sort of thing. There's a lot of things that you could do here. Maybe you might even have a custom field that is for job function that you could use here. But this will define your smart list, and you'll go through the process of doing this for each of your audiences here. And so this one, for example, we might do the same. Job title contains director and contains technology. And so that's the process that we would replicate to go through and build all of these segments that we have. Once we have that complete, before any members are assigned, we do need to approve the segment. Depending on how large your database is, this could take quite some time. This is going to process through your entire database and look for everyone who qualifies based on your smart list criteria here and assign them to the different segments. So for example, let's pop over to one that's been approved. After it's done, you're going to actually see the count of people that qualify for those different segments. Once this is approved, you can start to use your segmentation throughout the Marketo system. I mentioned dynamic content as one of the things that is reliant on segmentations. So, for example, if you're building an email and you've got a conference coming up, maybe you're running this conference in APAC, EMEA, North America, the content about the conference is going to be the same, right? The conference name, the speakers, that sort of thing, but maybe you have a different date and location. So you might have a text box that's dedicated to that information. Instead of having to create 3 different emails for this, you could potentially just create one. And you can take that information and make it dynamic. So here would be if we had geography, for example, using this particular use case, since we have an approved segment already for industry, I'm going to click that. But this is how you create dynamic content on a section of an email. So once you have that, you're going to have dynamic content as a choice here on the left for how this information is populated. With your default, this is going to be the first one that has a green check mark here. So what that means is the information that's here is approved. Well, we can go in here and edit and say, hey, this event will be held in EMEA, right? Then, for example, if our next one up, first it's going to grab the information from the default, but you're going to see here there's no green check mark next to it. That means this has not yet been edited. So it's going to take the information from default by default until we go in and actually change that. So then once we say, hey, this one is in APAC, now we have the green check mark next to it. And that same process continues up. Now, as you can also see here on the right-hand side, I have dynamic content in place here using 2 different segments. You can actually use multiple segments in here. Where you might see this come into play, particularly something like language preference or geography, is if you use snippets in the footers of your email. You can have dynamic content on a snippet and then have that loaded into your email. So if you've got information in your footer around your company, maybe you have location information, headquarters based on geography. You've got offices in New York, London, India, Tokyo, and you want the local address to display differently based on where a person is located. You can create a snippet in your system that's addressed by geo. And as a default, when you create a snippet, there's one version. It's just a static snippet. Or you can on the right click segment by and choose that segmentation that we're going to use. And just like we did the dynamic content in our emails, we're able to go in here and change the information that's listed. So maybe our default is our New York office. But maybe then for China, we've got a Beijing office. We've got one in Rome, one in Madrid, and one in Tokyo. One item to note with creating snippets, especially if you've got your dynamic content in play here, you also want to make sure that you have a text version for each of these. And you can start with copying from HTML, or you can write those custom. So if you do have a lot of HTML and code base that's brought over, maybe you just do a simple plain text. But this is how to actually create your snippets that leverage dynamic content. And then just like you would other areas, your emails or landing pages, you can drag in those snippets to replace the content that you had. And it's going to display the information that you have here based on the segmentation of your audience. So it does give you a lot of flexibility in terms of adding that additional layer of personalization without having to do this as a custom item every time you do an email. I've also seen this used in some really cool ways when it comes to things like sales owners and signature lines. If you're doing things like personalized emails, maybe a nurture stream or something that's ideally looking like it's coming from a sales team member. Sure, you might be able to, in your email, use tokens to do that from sales owner, first name, last name, email address, or you could create a snippet based on sales owners. And this, of course, is going to depend on how big your sales team is. As I mentioned, you can do up to 100 segments, but it gives you a little bit more customization. I used this with an organization that I worked with where we had a sales team that was for target accounts. There were about 35 sales team members, and we wanted to make it feel very personal and match the exact signature lines that these sellers would use when sending through their personal emails. Some would sign off with things like all the best wishes, have a great day, thanks for your time. But they also had differences in their actual signature lines. Some had phone numbers that were office lines, some had cell phone numbers, some had both. Different job titles, regions, industry segments, they were all a little bit different. And we wanted to be able to carry that flow from, a Marketo automated email into their personal email. So we started out by having them send us emails, copied what they had in their signature, and then built out these segmentations by sales owner. And then we were able to use that in our emails to create that extra level of personalized feel for those emails, leveraging the segmentations to be able to do that. It also let us do some advanced reporting, because that's one thing that you can also do with segmentations is layer them for reporting. And so to take a look at what that looks like, if you go into your system, say, for example, that you want to see how people are performing, or you want to look at some smart list information based on segment, you can actually use your segment information as a filter. And you can see here, if I type segment, our approved segmentations show up here under segmentation filter. So for that industry one, if we wanted to see, for example, how many people had responded to an email campaign that were a part of our technology industry segment, we could build a smart list on that. We can also use this filter in looking at reports. So things like our people performance reports or program performance reports, we can add in layers and look at how those different segments are performing against each other. So it's used in a couple of different ways in the system. There's a lot of different things that you can do with it. So definitely a cool way to create some customization and personalization beyond what you can do with tokens. So getting back to what we've got here in the deck, as I mentioned, you do have to have an approved segmentation for any of these things to be put into use. So that's the really key important part of that. Some other important things to note, of course, as I mentioned, segmentations are required for dynamic content. I'm going to call this out very importantly because when you're taking your exam, this might seem very familiar. Red alert, red alert. Again, you can create up to 20 segmentations. So do think carefully about the segmentations when you build them and make sure that there's something that's going to function well for your instance for the long haul and not just perhaps a one-off scenario. You can have up to 100 segments within your segmentations. I did put an item of note here. If you use a lot of custom filters to create your segments, you might have some difficulty approving just because of the volume of time that that's going to take, contact Marketo support if you have any issues. There's some things they can do on the back end to help with that process. Very rarely have I ever seen this run into, but just something to keep in mind if you do have a lot of unique complexities on your instance. And of course, order matters. So making sure you've got your segments in the order of priority that you want for the content that you're wishing to deliver. So let's talk through some sample exam questions. I've called out a couple of things as we went along, but taking a look at these, here's a couple of ideas of the types of questions you might see. So when it comes to tokens, the following token is added to a subject line in an email. Lead.company name default equals your company. What is the purpose of the token's default value, your company? Is it to display the lead's company name in the subject line? To replace the lead's company name in the lead database? To populate your company if the company name field is empty? Or to display your company in the subject line for every email recipient? So this was one of the ones that we talked about in the very beginning. It's to populate the value your company if the company name field is empty. Otherwise, people will see the value that exists on their person record for what their company name is. But this allows you to have something that's there instead of just a blank space. Question 2, which 3 steps should a marketer use to make an unsubscribe page appear in the reader's local language? So this is going to get into our segmentations a little bit. Is it to update the individual languages and set your default? To create a smart list for language for each preferred language? To create a segmentation for language with a segment for each preferred language? Create the content block on the landing page as dynamic, selecting the preferred language segmentation? Or create the content block on the landing page as dynamic, selecting the preferred language smart list for each language. So let's talk through this. This is a little bit tricky because these don't necessarily go in order. The answer is A, C, and D. So if you're going to do dynamic content on a landing page around language, we first need to have number C, or letter C, a segmentation. We need to have a segmentation that exists for each of the preferred languages that we're going to use for this purpose. From there, we would take the landing page, identify the content block that we want to make dynamic, and choose the preferred language segmentation. This is so that we are not choosing any of the other segmentations that we have. We're identifying that language is what's going to be the focus of displaying the content here. Once that's set up, then we actually go into each of the individual segments for that language and set what the content is going to be, as well as what our default will be for somebody who doesn't qualify into those specific language segments. Looking at the answers here that are incorrect, B and E, as we mentioned, talking about segmentations, smart lists are not something that you're able to use for dynamic content. The same for E. This one here, again, yes, it's got the piece of making the content block dynamic, but it mentions using a smart list as opposed to a segmentation, and smart lists cannot be used for dynamic content. So that's why your answers here are A, C, and D. Question number 3, what are the differences between segmentations and smart lists? A lead can exist in multiple segments, but not in multiple smart lists. B, smart lists can be used in smart campaigns, while segmentations cannot. C, segmentations can be used to create dynamic content, while smart lists cannot. D, smart lists can be used as a filter option when creating an email program, while segmentations cannot. Or E, smart lists are not mutually exclusive, but segmentations are. So the answer is C. This is one that we've talked about a couple of times in here, that segmentations are what you need for dynamic content. Some of the others here, leads can exist in multiple segments, but not multiple smart lists. Reverse that. People can be in multiple smart lists, not in multiple segments. Smart lists, we showed we can use segmentation filters in our smart lists. For D, goes back to the same thing. We can use a segmentation filter on a smart list. And smart lists are not mutually exclusive, but segmentations are. As we know, this is not the case when we're building our smart campaigns. So that's just a quick look at some of the types of questions that you're going to see on these areas. As I mentioned, this section does make up about 16% of the test. They are going to try to trick you as best as they can. That's the whole point of how they write the test. So make sure that you are looking for the keywords in the questions to help you identify what's going to be the right answers. I am going to open this up to questions at this time. So if you have any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute or type in the chat box and we can get this answered for you. So we've got one question around creating custom tokens that are based on, or creating tokens based on custom fields. Yes, if you have a custom field in Marketo or it's in Salesforce and synced to Marketo, that is something that you're going to be able to use as a token. If it's something that's unique to the person, that's one of those that's going to show up as a lead dot token or person token. If it's something that's on the account level as a custom field, it's going to be one of those that's going to be a company dot. But when you actually start to build out your email or landing page, you'll see that in a drop down. And actually, let's go over to the sandbox really quickly and I can show you what that would look like. So for example, if you were to be in your content section here and you wanted to say, hey, the number of products downloaded by your company, you might have a custom field that's product downloads. And so you'd be able to see that in the dropdown. Click that and populate that value. If there isn't something there, this is where you can create a custom value or a default value if there's not a value in that custom field and insert that. And then you'd be able to see that information populated. Yep. Other questions? No? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. As I mentioned, we do have quite a series of prep coming up for the next couple of weeks. We have 3 more webinar sessions. We also have open hours with our Marketo champions. There's 1 hour each week where you can jump on a call. It's open. You can ask any questions that you want around either the content that's been discussed so far, around the exam itself, or around your Marketo instance. Get those answered by our Marketo champion. We've got our 3 other sessions over the next areas of the exam. And then on March the 12th at 4 p.m., we are going to be hosted by Adage Technologies here in Chicago for an MCE prep and review session. So we're actually going to all sit down together in the room, take a MCE practice exam so we can get a feel for what that's like, what the testing environment might feel like. And then we'll go through all of the exam questions, similarly to how we went through the 3 here. What are the questions? What are the right answers? What makes them the wrong answers? And what are some keywords to watch out for as we're preparing for the exam? If you do have any questions about any of these, please let us know. Our new registration page is located at mugs.marketo.com. You'll find the Chicago Marketo users group there and be able to register for any of our upcoming sessions. Again, if you do have any questions on anything, please feel free to let myself, Andy, or Renee know. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you at one of our future sessions. Thank you so much.